Hello and welcome to the Bridgerland Technical College Apprenticeship Copper Project video. Today we're going to look at how we build this one. This is an offset plus a rolling offset. It's a little more complex, but we're going to go step by step on how to do this. When you come to lab, you want to make sure that you bring certain tools such as your torch, striker, something to cut copper, a tubing cutter, fitting brushes, reamer, channel locks, a level. You might bring a variety of options for cutting copper. We have some of the smaller thumb cutters there. I would definitely recommend that you bring a framing square and a Sharpie. You might want to bring a measuring tape as well, but the framing square is what we use mostly. Now there are fittings that will be provided for you in the lab. When you get to the lab, you'll want to gather those up, and those would be based off of what you need for the project. The lab will provide you with the copper, fittings, solder, flux, sandcloth, and we have some bricks for building up and supports. This is also what they will typically provide for you at the state test. Now before you start, you want to make sure you look very carefully over all measurements and do the math. Double check your measurements, all of your measurements end to center and center to center on the practical before you begin. For this particular project, we're going to divide this into separate sections. First we'll build the flat base. Then we're going to build our rolling offset with 245s, and finally we'll have the top 90 with an adapter, and we're going to fit it together in this order. As with all copper projects, regardless of what you're doing in plumbing, you'll want to follow the standard procedures for copper. Of course, you would ream the pipe after cutting it, clean it with some sand cloth, or mesh abrasive cloth. The fittings will also need to be cleaned. Oops, my fitting brush was a little too small there. If you don't have the right size fitting brush, you can always use your sand cloth and just rub the inside of the fitting. Once we have those cleaned, we're going to flux both the outside of the pipe and the inside of the fitting. Now this process will be demonstrated throughout the project, but most of the assembly is going to be fast forwarded. Just want to point out the basic steps and the importance of following those steps in any copper solder project. Now we're going to start measuring for cuts. We've measured over on the pipe to where the center should end. Then we've measured on the T where the center of the T is, and you can see we're measuring here over to where the pipe would end inside the T. This is called a fitting allowance. If we do not subtract that fitting allowance, our pipe is going to be too long from end to center. So it's very important that we know where the center is and where we're going to cut to make sure that our end to center measurements line up where they ought to. Now this is another process that will be repeated throughout this whole project. Finding the center of the fitting and subtracting back or measuring back to where the pipe goes into the fitting for our cut. You can see here we're preparing the pipe, removing an extra burr and reaming. Making sure that the T is properly cleaned, at which point we will flux the pipe and fitting. As we assemble this, we're going to want to make sure that our end to center measurement is accurate. By putting it against the framing square with the cap against the square, we can see exactly where the center measures out, and any adjustments can be made. Now this particular piece seemed a little bit loose, so by crimping with some channel locks on the outside of the fitting, you can create a more snug fit. Crimp and twist, then it's less likely to move or slip out. Same thing can be done on either fitting. And for this one, it seemed worth it to make sure that it was going to stay at the measurement that we needed. We're now preparing the pipe and the fitting, the cap for the other side of the base. Same standard process. Other than I forgot to ream, so I had to come back and take care of that. Once again, measuring over using the square, marking center, and marking our cut. Reaming, sanding, and adding flux. The 1-inch portion of our base will soon be ready. We're going to measure again against the side of the framing square. And make any adjustments that might be needed. From here, we're going to start working with a 3/4 inch pipe. We want to prepare the piece that's coming out from the T, and to make sure our cut is accurate, we're also going to need to measure with our 45. We're preparing the pipe and fitting. Here you can see the center lines on a 45 fitting. The intersection of those two center lines on the top of the fitting is where we want to measure as we're going for the center line of pipe on all of our measurements. Now that we have that marked, we can put that on the framing square and mark over where the center to center measurement would be. Again, this is not our cut. That line is going to measure up with the center of the T. We need to subtract for our fitting. By lining up our pipe and the T, we can see and mark where that cut would need to be, where the pipe would end inside the fitting. Once again, without removing our fitting allowances, or the space taken up by the fitting, our pipe and measurement would be too long from center to center on our fittings. So it's important to be accurate that way. As we prepare pipe and fitting, this base will soon be ready. To solder it, we've put it up on bricks, keep it away from the table. We're going to go around, starting with the larger pipes, heating the fitting and the pipes, applying solder. Now the purpose of soldering all of this together is that once this base is solid, it'll be easier for us to assemble the other parts. If we were to take this entire project, make all of our cuts and only solder at the very end, it can be very difficult to make sure that all of our center to end measurements and center to center measurements are accurate. So by doing this in pieces and soldering together the base first, we can make sure it's going to work. I'm just going back through and cleaning up any drips or other solder pieces. At this point, the base is ready. You can set that aside until later. I'm going to remove the bricks and clean up this workspace just a little bit. It's time to start thinking about the next portion of this project. We've completed the base. Now we're going to need our offsets. That is the 245s that will be used as a rolling offset. Once again, it's best if this is all soldered together. It'll make it easier to assemble later. We're going to follow the process: cleaning, preparing, measuring, and assembling these offsets, finding our centers. This time we're using a 90. Once again, you'll observe we've marked the center lines and the intersection point. That is where we want to measure to. We're going to line that up, mark where the pipe would end inside the fitting, and make our cut. Now that we have our 45s, we've got to really consider this angle. It can still move, and if it's not oriented correctly or in a straight line, it's going to make a mess out of this project. What we need is for this entire section to be in a completely flat horizontal plane. To get that, I'm just going to press it down against the table. The 90 on the end is not going to be soldered at this point, but it gives me the ability to push against the table and get a nice flat line. Now I've marked the pipe and fittings with a marker so that when I pick it up, if anything moves, I'll be able to see and I can orient things back the way it should be. Making sure that everything's as flat as possible, putting it back up on bricks so we can get ready to solder this. I'm taking the time to look at this over and over. I'm looking down the line to make sure that it's totally straight as I can see it. Once I'm confident, then it's time to solder. Now having this section all soldered together is again going to make things easier when it's time to assemble. With 345s, if all three of them are loose and we're trying to get them to line up where they should go, it can be very difficult to get the correct angles, the correct offsets, and by soldering this together, we create a very rigid section. And when it comes time to assemble, we're down to just the 145 leading into this section. The rest of this is all exactly as it ought to be. I've got this well heated. Now I'm cleaning up the underside, making sure there's no extra goobers. I got a little extra solder on the end there. Tried to clean it off. Remember, when you turn in your project, it's a reflection of your work, so if you take the time to make it look nice, Your judges, or those grading your projects, are going to be more impressed than if it's sloppy. This piece I'll be assembling with the base, but it's too hot to work with, so by running it under some water, I can cool it off quickly, and then I don't have to wait as long before I start assembling the rest of this project. Having the base and the offset done, I'm going to work for a minute on the vertical, preparing the male adapter at the end, getting the right measurements to center, and subtracting for the 90 for the cut. At this point, just checking and double checking centers to make sure this piece is exactly where it should be. Now we have all the pieces ready, the base, the rolling offset, and our vertical rise on the end. We just need to get this up and assemble. Our first offset off of the base is going to be a 45 degree. Preparing that fitting and our offset. And once again, when we assemble, if our base has a different length on one side or another, we'd want to make sure that we have the base oriented correctly. Also, we'd want to make sure that we have the correct side of our offset, as the measurements on either end might be different. With this 45 in place, I can play with and adjust the rolling offset. You can see here, I don't want it straight ahead. This needs to roll off to the right side. But how much? And how do I know when I'm accurate? Let's look at a few options for how to make sure this is done correctly. We'll set it aside for a minute. Let's start with our framing square. I'm going to mark a line right on the table that I can measure from, using a pencil or a Sharpie. Now, I typically wouldn't advise writing on desks or tables, but in the lab, we're okay with this. This will make a big difference on your ability and accuracy, so a few lines on the table is not a big deal. I'm going to move that square over. My offset is 6 inches, so I've moved the square 6 inches, and I'm marking another line. Okay, follow me here. If center to center on a pipe is 6 inches apart, then the edge of the pipe would also be 6 inches apart. That's the principle we're running off here. Before I measure though, I'm going to create some support so that it'll hold itself up here. Let's see, I've got a brick and what else? Yeah, how about some plumber's putty? Plumber's putty should do the job. It's rigid and yet malleable. I can adjust it up to where I need it. It's just one idea. You're going to need to have something for support. But you can see here with a brick and some plumber's putty, I can adjust that pipe up until it's level or horizontally level. You might actually check that with a level if you have a small one, otherwise I might measure up off the table. Now I'm going to use my framing square to double check my rolling offset here. On the base, I've got my side of pipe right even with my line. I'm adjusting to the right my offset so that when I put my square down to the table on the other line, it's going to tell me if I'm accurate. If the pipe is touching the square at this point, I'm really close. There's some other ways I can verify. I can measure up from the table, or I can measure from the center of my T to the center of my rolling offset like this. You can see here, it ought to look right down the center of that pipe, and if that's the case, my offset's pretty accurate. I'm double checking other measurements here, center to center on my 45, just to make sure before I solder that each of those is accurate. Once I'm confident, I'm ready to solder this fitting. My offset should be in the right spot. I've got it braced up on my brick and plumber's putty. I made sure that it rolls over the right distance. Once I solder this together, should be in pretty good shape for the offset and the rolling offset. Finally, it's time to put our vertical on. We've already measured all of this and checked it before. But at this point, I'm just going to get it ready. Flux the fitting, flux the pipe. Now from here you're going to see quite a bit of adjustment. I'm looking straight on, making sure that that pipe stands vertical. Once I got this last piece on, it kind of needed some counterweight, so I've put a brick back on the base to help hold it up. But I'm going to take some time to really measure, checking everything. Measurements up from the table, making sure that everything's where it ought to be before I finish this. Center to center on fittings, making sure that it's square. And finally, we'll solder this together. Now on the state test, you'll want to make sure to solder that adapter on the top. For our copper lab purposes at the school, we would ask you not to. It's an expensive fitting, and if we can reuse that, it'll help save a little bit of money for the school and help our lab budget to go a little bit farther. So again, don't solder it on in the lab, but when you're on your state test, make sure you solder on that adapter. Once that's soldered together, we can do our final measurements. Measuring up from the table and finding 5/8 from the center of the base down to the table. I'm going to add that. Here I'm verifying that I've got 6 inches to the center from the end. I'm going to measure up from the table to my first offset to make sure that that's right. It should be 5 inches plus 5/8. We've got that right to the center. I know it's accurate. From there, I'm going to follow my rolling offset up. I'm going to get a measurement to the top of the male adapter. It should be 12.5 plus 5/8. That's 13 1/8. Looking good here. Don't forget to make sure your project is cool before you hand it off to whoever's grading the project. Take the time to clean up the lab, make sure it's left better than you found it. Good luck on your project, and good luck on your state test.